So this is the introduction to recovering feeder pneumatics inside of a player piano. These are the portions that supply the suction to the rest of the piano controls to keep them operating, obviously. And so we're just going over the process for recovering and the details regarding their reconstruction.
So what are all of the components that comprise feeder pneumatics?
So the pieces of a feeder pneumatic are the two feeders. These are connected to the two pedals that you'll find on the player piano. And as you alternate feet, each one of these is opening and providing suction. And when they're working in tandem, they are feeding that suction over here to what's called the reservoir. The reservoir acts like a regulator to even out the suction that these two are producing. Because if we did not have the reservoir, each time you pulled with the pedal one of these feeders open, that would spike the pressure in the piano, and then it would drop the pressure in the piano as it's no longer sucking. So you'd have big roller coasters of pressure going through the piano, and that would cause the notes that are being played, every other one would be really loud, the other one would be really soft because of the inconsistencies in pressure that's being supplied.
Okay.
And the force that's being applied to striking the hammers against the strings. So this thing takes the feed from these two feeders and it regulates it. So when the suction is applied, this collapses slightly, and in the interim where this is not applying pressure, this is what then is applying the pressure to the piano at the same consistent, even supply to the rest of the pneumatic system. So it acts like a battery backup, if you will, so that it just evens out the flow into the piano, keeping everything running smoothly. So these two operate like so, and they have two one-way valves inside of them. These are called flap valves or check valves, basically. And we've got one on the inside here, and we've got one on the outside here. So that as you pull this open, the first check valve is opening, allowing suction, pulling the air from inside the reservoir, and then it traps it as this begins to collapse so that it can't re-enter into the system. And then that's when the second valve actuates and lets the air out of this pneumatic as it's closing and exhausting it to atmosphere.
Because you're sucking air out of the system, you're not
sucking it,
putting it in. Okay, so
exactly.
So the air comes from, let's see, it comes in through here or in through the tracker bar?
Yeah.
Either one?
Either one.
Okay, so if it comes in through the tracker bar, it actuates the note. If it, but I guess the whole system is supplied mainly by the transmission or the
by the transmission there. That's the wind motor.
The wind motor, okay.
Yeah. Or the stack, which is the pile of pneumatics that are inside the piano.
So it goes from the wind motor to the striker pneumatics?
So there's two different outputs usually from this area here. This one here on the left feeds the striker pneumatics inside the piano.
It pulls from the striker pneumatics?
It pulls from the striker pneumatics. So it creates a vacuum inside their decks. And so then that creates the discrepancy. So there's vacuum always present inside of there because we've removed the air via the feeders and the reservoir.
Okay.
And then as the piano tells it to fire, it allows that suction that's being stored, that potential energy, into that striker pneumatic. It collapses, and then when the hole is covered up again, that pneumatic is exposed to atmosphere and allowed to reinflate because it's no longer under the suction that's being supplied from this. And so one of those ends goes to that stack, and then the other side comes up to directly feed this wind motor
right there.
here. Yeah, through that port.
Okay.
So you'll have two trunks coming up through the piano usually from either side of this section.
Okay, so you said one side, the reservoir goes to the striker pneumatic stack.
So
and then
actually,
the pedals.
this reservoir I'll show you this other part, is actually directly attached to this trunk right here. And so these two feeders are directly attached to this trunk, and the reservoir is attached to this trunk. So the interesting thing with pneumatic power is that everything, so long as it's attached to the same system, it will all be influenced by whatever has the strongest influence. So where these feeders are intermittent in their work, it provides suction and then it stops, it provides suction and then it stops. When they stop providing suction, they aren't the main thing in control of this wind supply anymore because they're not contributing anything. This reservoir then takes over control of the wind system because it's collapsed. Now it is providing suction because it's trying to reopen. And so in those lulls, via the springs that are inside of it. And then that controls and makes it so that there's even pressure through this trunk all the way across. So as long as this piece here, this reservoir, is attached to the system, it provides that evening power no matter where in the system it's applied. Mm-hmm. It's usually just down by the feeders because it's big, and because if you control it near where the suction's being generated, it has a greater influence in evening out the pressure. But it would still work if it was even up next to the wind motor. So just as long as it's connected to the system, it can provide that steadying that's going on.
Does the strength of the reservoir spring need to be regulated?
Not usually. It does when the piano is initially built, but the springs, in my experience, don't fatigue too much over time. And according to my measurements with vacuum pressure gauges, they've been pretty consistent and don't need any re-regulation. So there we go. So this pulls that air out and then exhausts it out, and you can kind of see here, this flap valve jumps up as it's letting the air that it's pulled from the system to exit this pneumatic again out the other side. So 2 one-way check valves. Just like that. So that is sort of the overview. Once you leave this system and you come up to these areas, this is how, and that's why these two are separated, the feed for the wind motor and the feed for the stack. So the pressure is in this main trunk right here, and then you get into the tempo regulator, which then feeds the wind motor. So this tempo regulator is a slide valve that is triangular shaped, and depending on how much of that opening is covered, controls how much flow is allowed to enter the wind motor. And if there's a very small amount of wind, the motor will turn very slow. If the valve is all the way open, the wind motor will turn very fast. And so that's what controls the tempo in the piano. So this suction is then entering this control box, which has this control arm right here, which is what goes up to the key desk and allows you to control the tempo because it's related to that whole system. Then, once it's allowed to pass beyond this control valve, it's then allowed to exit through this port and go up to the wind motor. On the other side, this is just a on-off valve. So when the piano is trying to rewind the scroll, we don't want the suction to be trying to strike the notes as the scroll is going backwards, because then you'll hear the song in reverse. Mm-hmm. So when you switch into re-roll to rewind the piano scroll, this actually shuts off the vacuum supply to the stack and the striker pneumatics, preventing them from being able to play.
Got it.
And this right here is just a small version of this. So in fluid dynamics, fluid dynamic engineering, this big bellows does a really good job evening out the really big swells and stuff like that. But since it's so big and its motion is so arduous, it doesn't clean out anything small. So little flitters and judders and stuff like that are still able to get through. And a lot of the times, that's what this piece is for. It will even out all of those smaller ones because it's so much smaller and can react so much quicker to all of the little jitters and stuff like that.
Is there always a secondary reservoir?
Not all the time. This one seems to be sort of unique in that it has one. A lot of the time, they don't go to the effort of going that far with the wind regulation, but this one did. So this is just a case of this specific model, this specific style.
And the spring on the larger reservoir is internal, and it looks like
Yes.
the spring on the smaller reservoir is that
External.
one right
Mhm.
there. Okay.
Yeah, there's when you need to provide so much force and so much opening force, you have to have what are called, we call them winker springs in the organ world, but they're really just leaf spring, basically. And so they exert so much force that it's sometimes easier just to have it internal, and you don't have any external components to worry about or get hung up on. But I have seen some player pianos where they will have two blocks mounted on the outside, and the spring will rest just on the sides with
Two
the
springs
reservoir.
one on each side.
One on each side, to try and maintain pressure on the lid, because if the pressure on the lid is unequal, the wood will start to warp because of all the force that's being applied two different ways. So there's usually either one spring right here in the middle, down low, or there can be two springs on the side to maintain.
And this is for
balance.
servicing the spring?
Yes, yeah. So when you open this plate here, you can reach in, collapse the spring, and pull it out, and then the bellows is free to move.
Have you ever had to replace the spring?
I have, yes. So sometimes those springs will actually crack along where they're riveted together, because they look kind of like a childhood drawing of a bird, you know, it like goes out and then out like that. So they're riveted together down at the bottom, and sometimes that metal will fatigue and rust, and it will crack. And when it cracks like that, it loses a lot of strength because it's no longer firmly anchored to its counterpart. So I have had to replace them before. And when I do that, I will try my best to figure out about what adjustment it was at, but that's when you actually have to have the vacuum gauge to tell how much pressure the piano is operating on. Because across the board, pianos generally tend to operate on about 20 inches of water column of inches in mercury, I guess if you want to call it that. The way that you measure vacuum. It's about 20 inches of mercury or so. So that's, you have to have a special gauge for it, and they're easy to find. But in those cases, you have to reset and make the system run off of that kind of pressure
So
again.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. There's a trunk that connects both of the pedal
Yeah.
pneumatics and the reservoir.
So this whole trunk runs the entire length,
So why?
and these aren't allowed to communicate with that unless it's through this trunk,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And so that means all three are also connected to both the stack and the wind motor.
Yes, unless these isolation valves are acting. So
Okay,
each
so
of
that
these
shuts
two
off.
boxes,
Yeah, that shuts off the stack
yeah, that's the stack.
and opens only to the wind motor.
Yeah, and this one only controls the wind motor. So these two are actually divided in half here, the entire length. So that isolates, or this one is probably isolated just right here. So that this tiny corner is the only thing that's allowed unrestricted access to this main feed trunk. And that as this opens, it opens this hole here in the middle and allows the vacuum to come up and over and then through this port
Okay,
there on the side.
got it. And
So these act
the
like
only-
gateways on both sides.
Okay, so there are only three main. Well, let's see. The inlets and outlets. It's a closed system of air, except for. Okay, air goes in. This is an inlet.
Yeah.
Inlet, and these two are the only outlets.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Aside from the striker pneumatics down there too, how they have those valves, so they allow the suction in, but when the valve tells the note to relax, that allows the pneumatic to fill with ambient air, and so that when it's time to strike again, that ambient air is then sucked into the system. So each striker pneumatic is also
its
an
own
inlet to the
Inlet,
system.
not an outlet,
Not an outlet, no,
but its own inlet.
but its own inlet. Because this is the only outlet. This is the only thing that pulls air out of the system. So all of the strikers let a small amount of air in. This lets a small amount of air in, and that lets a small amount of air in. And these are the only outlets.
Okay. Okay. It's slowly coming together.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing that they did all of this engineering back in the late 1800s.
It'll make more sense when I
when you do it. Yeah.
Drinking from a fire hose. It's hard to just process a bunch of information all at once. So
Okay, so inlet, striker pneumatics or inlet, those two are the only outlet. Other than that, okay, so it's a closed system of air.
yeah,
Okay, except for those
five
except for those
areas.
5 areas.
I'm counting these as
Those
two
as
areas.
two. Yeah. Okay. You could maybe kind of think of it as your digestive system is a closed system, except for you have an inlet, and then you've got a couple outlets.
Thank you for that.
Surprisingly accurate. Yeah, that's a really good
That's
way to
kind
think
of
about
it.
it. Yeah. Very, very close.
Okay.
Memory tricks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or relating it to something that you're familiar with.
Connor, what does that small tube outlet on the left?
This guy?
No, the even smaller one.
Oh,
Connect to?
that
Because
is a
that
great
has to-
question. Yes, this is a separate thing. They are directly connected to your expression units. So these have to operate under constant vacuum as well. Thank you for bringing that up, Nacho. And we've got 2 of them on this side, as you can see, and you've probably noticed. They run directly to your expression pneumatics, and since they don't require any kind of regulated air, they don't have to shut off when the piano is going into re-roll mode. They are allowed to just be under constant vacuum, and so I'll show you the operation here. So I'm going to apply constant vacuum here, and this is the signal hose. So when the signal is open, that's allowing the valve to reset, and that tells this that it is time for the pneumatic to close. And then when it is sealed over again,
Closes, it actuates.
it closes, it actuates, and it opens, it disengages.
So its rest position is open when it's under normal atmospheric pressure.
Yes. yeah,
Open / disengaged.
Yes. Yep. And so
Is that everything?
that is pretty much everything. Open
Everything
is
is when
disengaged.
it's under the power of suction, it's actuating.
It's actuating.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I'll illustrate that. This constant vacuum is not allowed to talk to this unless this is being signaled to. So I'll show that right here.
You're sucking.
I'm sucking, this is open, and so this is acting like it's getting a signal and it's time to actuate. And so if I cover it, so that's how it's able to reset. When you cover this, that exposes the inside of this pneumatic to outside atmosphere. And so then this is where the inlet to the system comes in. It draws open and allows it to pull air from the vent, which is somewhere. Oh, it's hiding in there, in the green felt. Air is allowed to move in and into this pneumatic and allow it to relax.
When it closes?
When
you
it
close,
opens.
when you
Signal tube.
when you
Oh,
close
yeah.
the signal tube,
When I
It
close the
allows-
signal tube,
it allows air to go in.
yeah, because the valve inside of this block resets. And so this valve inside controls whether or not suction from this is allowed to enter into this. So when the valve is closed, this suction has nowhere to go, and that means that this is then exposed to atmosphere and is allowed to just rise open.
So you were sucking the whole time,
So I was sucking the whole time,
and opening and closing just by.
just by covering that port. So if I do that again, I'll suck the entire time. So as I cover that and it's able to relax, that's where the air is allowed to come into the pneumatic. And then when I open this, that shoves the valve the other way and closes this exposure to atmosphere, and then exposes this to the suction that I'm providing and forces it to collapse.
Is
which
it a one-way valve
actuated.
like these on the?
It is a sort of a, more of a two-way valve because it allows the air in from one side, the atmosphere, to allow it to open,
Yeah. Okay.
and then it goes to the other side to let the suction in from the other.
So you say that's for expression. Is that like an option on, like,
Yes.
you're working on it's affecting volume or something? to
Yeah,
affect-
so let's go
I can show
to
you
the
that.
piano to look at that. Because Nacho's got one of them installed.
Yeah. Do you want to show him that, Nacho?
This one. This is soft play, I think. Oh.
You're sucking the whole time.
Yeah, I'm sucking the whole time.
And his thumb is
So
what's
that's-
causing it to trigger.
He's signaling.
hmm And so these are called expression units because it's moving the hammers closer, and so it's giving you the chance to play the piano quieter, give it more expression.
So these buttons are what actuate the open and closed valve.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So those are directly controlled from this key slip. You'll have 3 of them typically. The one that you see there is soft for the bass. There's one over here that will be mounted that's soft for the treble. And then the third one is typically mounted down in the lower case on the same rod as the sustain pedal. And when that collapses, that allows the piano to play sustain and turn off sustain. So that's basically the same thing as pushing the sustain pedal up and down. So your 3 pneumatics will cover treble, bass, and sustain.
I'm just at a loss. When you engage the expression,
Mhm.
are you relieving pressure or creating pressure?
So technically you're creating pressure because you're telling the pneumatic to actuate, which is telling it to close, which is bringing the suction into the pneumatic and telling it to actuate. So you're technically doing both at the same time. You're relieving the pressure in the signal wire, which lets the valve seat to the other side and lets the vacuum come in and actuate the pneumatic. And then when you close the signal system, there's a bleed that lets vacuum fill that line again, so that both lines are then under vacuum again. And that pulls the valve back down and then isolates the pneumatic so that it's exposed
maybe you
to
could think
atmosphere.
of it as atmosphere is how many pounds per square inch, like 18 or something,
Yeah.
14. I can't remember what it is, but
Yeah.
let's say it's 14. I don't know what the number is. We'll just
Yeah,
call
well,
it that.
less
If
than
you-
20.
Yeah, less than 20. So every square inch of your body, every square inch of everything is exposed to, whatever the number is, 14 pounds per square inch, right? And if you're in a system that's either below that or above that, either way, there's pressure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If it's below that number, you have suction pressure, where it's trying to come back to, am I getting
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
correctly?
yeah.
Where it wants to come back to atmosphere. If it's above that, it's pressure also trying to get back to atmosphere. It's higher pressure. So one is negative pressure. Either way, it's pressure.
Yeah. If you
Right?
think of a latex balloon, that's positive pressure above. So the balloon is
Yeah.
allowed to inflate because you're putting more pressure than atmosphere, so the balloon is allowed to swell. And if you take your mouth off of it, it's allowed to be exposed to atmosphere, and it deflates, and it equalizes inside of itself. Piano pneumatics are exactly the opposite, where if you take all of the air out of this
So
big
now
wedge,
it's below atmosphere.
so now it's below atmosphere, it collapses really fast because atmosphere is providing force. There's a negative space that it wants to crush to equalize itself, basically.
So the reservoir is actually a negative
yes,
pressure.
is a negative.
And so what you're doing when a hole goes over the tracker bar from the paper roll, what that's doing is that's allowing atmosphere to rush in that hole and only actuate the one striker pneumatic that then deflates because it's now atmosphere.
Yeah, it's less than atmosphere now,
It's
and that allows it to collapse.
collapse.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's at rest, it's at atmosphere,
Mhm.
and then when it sucks in,
Then when when the valve is exposed to atmosphere, it switches over and allows the pneumatic to be under negative atmosphere and collapse. Yeah, it's it's a confusing system. So these valves are always resting with atmosphere.
With atmosphere.
And so
And
when
those are one-way valves?
these are one-way valves. And so they're happy to rest down because they're being pulled down by suction and pushed down by atmosphere. So when this tube here is exposed to atmosphere, that's where that leather pouch is then allowed to inflate. Because that leather pouch is under vacuum on both sides. So when the underside of the pouch is exposed to atmosphere, that pouch inflates, and that's what pushes this valve stem up. And then that closes the book pneumatic away from the atmosphere and then supplies it with the suction that it's currently sealing inside of that trunk. So this valve goes up, the vacuum is allowed to come in from underneath this valve, and that's what sucks that striker pneumatic shut right there.
And when it slams shut, that little foot,
Yeah.
what do you call it?
We call it a finger, but
A finger.
whatever appendage
Okay.
you'd like.
The finger is what then? That's what these little.
Yeah, we can slide this.
Yeah, this is not.
It's not
Yeah,
installed.
That's what
The-
these little hook things. What are those? Are those? Those are feet.
We can call those feet. Yeah, that's
Okay,
more of a foot.
So the finger on the back of the. You called it a book pneumatic. Is it a book pneumatic or a striker pneumatic?
They're sort of synonymous. Its proper name is a striker pneumatic.
Okay. So the finger of the striker pneumatic, when it collapses, is what engages the foot to play the note. You see that? See all these fingers? So this collapses. These are the ones that you're rebuilding right now.
Yeah.
So when that collapses like this, that's just enough movement of the finger on the end of the striker pneumatic to engage
And pull up there.
and play the note.
And so inside of this deck, there is that vacuum that's coming up from the feeders. So there's a tiny slit that runs the whole way along this. So that this whole internal portion of the deck is under that vacuum from these two feeders. So when, and I don't know if you've seen it yet, have you seen those leather pouches inside of the piano?
I don't think so, because when you guys just said.
Okay, yeah, the
I didn't
pouches
know
are
what you were
probably
talking
throwing a huge wrench into things right now.
These are the pouches.
Oh, so here we go. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, he doesn't have the pouches.
So these are the leather pouches. So this is a pseudo example of what's going on right there. So these tubes here on the top are basically the same as these holes here on
This
the
is a
side.
different design.
This is a different design.
This one, these are two different pianos.
Right.
Yeah.
This one, it has the leather pouches stacked
Yeah.
immediately on each striker pneumatic. There's
Mm-hmm.
a row here, there's a row inside there, and then there's a third row there. Whereas
Yeah.
this one, all of them are on the same deck.
So if you imagine, yeah, it's got the same three decks, but this one is turned vertically, where all of those are all horizontal in their decks in 3 levels. And so this whole chamber is exposed to the vacuum from the feeders. So it wants to pull these pouches up. But the reason the vacuum doesn't
this is the
pull
inside.
them,
We're looking at the inside of
we're
the
looking
deck.
at the inside of the deck. Yeah,
Okay,
so
so-
we're in the vacuum
So
side.
it's sucking these leather pouches up, and this is a very thin leather. Feel that?
Yeah.
Whoa.
It's like
Very thin,
Very
very
thin.
supple.
yeah.
And so the reason all of these aren't just inflated all of the time is because of these little brass bleed cups right here. That allows both sides of the pouch to be under the exact same level of pressure. And so when a player piano scroll comes across this tracker bar, sorry, sliding off the blanket, that exposes this tiny port to atmosphere. And since This hole is by far bigger than the pinprick bleed down there. Atmosphere is allowed to be the controlling ambient environment. So that's what lets this puff up, because we're pulling in. This is under suction, trying to pull as much as it can, and then the player piano lets the air in from atmosphere under here. So like the piano book pneumatic collapses, this inflates because it's not balanced on both sides anymore. The underside in this well that this pouch is sealing against is allowed to inflate. So I'll kind of simulate that right here. Air comes in through here. It allows those to puff like that.
Each of these holes, each of these is its own individual chamber.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Not exposed to any of the others.
Right.
And each of these holes corresponds to one pouch.
Which is why they're staggered like this, because they come down, down, down. They just, sort of feed down and make room as necessary. So that's why they're tilted.
Okay.
To get, each one in row
Right.
without communicating with each other.
And then they push this button, right?
Yeah, so then this, let's set this down. So these little discs, sort of just communicating back to what we're looking at, these white discs that you can see are the back sides, which are the same as this little disc that you can see. So when that pouch is then allowed to puff up and inflate, because this hole is open, that pushes this valve closed like that, which then stops the pneumatic from being free to fall open in the atmosphere. And then, sorry, I gotta back up a little bit. This little valve inside of here is a two-way valve. Let me see if I can get some light on it. So you can kind of see deep inside of there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, come over here, you can see it.
So you can see how when I push this up, there's a metal disc down there. So when this is pushed up, your striker pneumatic is attached directly to this opening. So that's what allows it to move at all, to communicate with anything. So when this valve is down, that metal disc down there is sealing the vacuum inside of this chamber. So the vacuum is not allowed to be in this small area because this is sealing the vacuum down, and this small leather valve up here is allowing atmosphere in to this chamber. So that means the striker pneumatic is allowed to just rest open, because the only thing connected at this point to that striker pneumatic is this small chamber, which is sealed on the bottom side, and it's open on the top side. So that's the only thing that chamber is allowed to communicate with right now. So when this gets the signal and this pouch inflates, that pushes this valve stem on the bottom upwards, which then seals this port shut completely and opens the vacuum down at the bottom, which then is what allows the air to be sucked out and collapse that pneumatic. And so then when the note is done playing, the piano covers this hole again with the scroll. Vacuum is allowed to bleed back through here, so now that this pouch is equalized on both sides, it can deflate. Then the suction pulls this valve back down because it's pulling air in, and so the air wants to rush in, but it just pulls the valve shut, seals the valve. It's pushing down. And then air is allowed to rush in through this port and allow the pneumatic to fall open again, because there's no longer any force pulling it shut. So now it's just allowed to reinflate and open.
Gosh, this engineering is amazing.
It is incredible engineering. And the thing that makes the piano operate so quickly too is the weight of the hammer sitting on top of the striker pneumatic. So the hammer wants to reset, and that pushes the lid of the hammer open, or the striker pneumatic open, so that it can reset faster, so you can get really fast trills and stuff all the way through the piano, because the weight of the piano was resetting all those strikers. Actions. So yeah, all these things just flutter and tick away, and you get a song at the end of it.
It's like magic.
At lightning speed, yeah.
Cool. Amazing.
Any questions? Or how many questions?